Oh, you're so cool, Brewster. Welcome to Hey Guys Podcast. I'm Rob, this is Liam. And for our final film in the HUGtober season, we watched Fright Night. Now, we have done a few vampire films on this show. Lost Boys and Near Dark spring to mind. Two highly rated films by us and two completely different films. Fright Night seems to stand alone, its humour always finding a way through to the main stage. Chris Sarandon plays Jerry, the attractive neighbour next door who may be just a bit more than a neighbour bargained for. He is a vampire, you see. Well, if you ask 45-year-old Charlie Brewster, because apparently nobody else but him can hear the screams of the women coming from that house. And I argue, why does Charlie need binoculars when it appears he can just reach out and touch Jerry's house? Well, anyway, it's up to Charlie, Amy, Ed, and washed-up actor Peter Vincent to defeat Jerry and his friend Billy. I say friend because I honestly don't know what Billy is to Jerry. Is he his Renfield, or is he just a living butler? Fright Night plays out like a stage play, most of the action taking place in Jerry's house. The film moves at a decent pace that before you can ask, why was this choice made, you've moved on to the next scene and then the next. Right up until we get to the final showdown of Jerry and Charlie. Oh, and then the other final showdown. And then the final showdown. So far, HUGtober has been good to us. We've had nothing but 4-star films. Will Fright Night be number 5, or will we rate this higher or lower? I'm really interested to see how you feel about this film, Liam, nearly 40 years on from its original release.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because it kind of, to me, sits in the same bracket as the movie we did last week, American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
It feels more 80s than that, but it's a film that almost feels out of time because in some respects it feels very old, but in other respects it feels surprisingly modern. And it's amazing, the impact you can see that this film's had on subsequent movies.
Yeah.
And, it even talks about it in this film that, they reference slasher movies. Like this film was really swimming upstream back in, 1985? The popular movies of the time were Freddy, Jason, all that jazz. This was a movie looking backwards towards the horror movies and the stylings of the 1950s, obviously with, I keep going Vincent Price. It's not Vincent Price, it's Peter Vincent. But it's obviously supposed to be Vincent Price, and we'll come to the fact that it was legitimately supposed to be Vincent Price playing that character. But it means that it's a movie that in some ways, despite the fact that it has the trappings of an 80s movie, has aged so much better than the movies that came out around it. Like, if you go back and watch a slasher movie, it feels trapped in the 80s in every respect in terms of the tone and everything about it. This, yes, some of the fashion feels trapped in the 80s. I mean, I would argue that Charlie and Amy's fashion actually feels like it's trapped in the 50s, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the tone and everything else about it feels like it's from a different time. Although you could make an argument. I've heard some people describe this film as a John Hughes horror film. And I think that is a surprisingly accurate description.
I mean, it is very like Home Alone-esque as well.
Oh, yeah. It's got that vibe as well, for sure. But it's got something, it doesn't have a nasty edge to it. Everything feels surprisingly low key. And I think it's to bring it back to what you said, the fact that it feels almost like a stage play because everything feels small. Like, you can make an argument that the city, and we'll get to wherever this is set, feels very empty at times until they go into the nightclub. But for the most part,
I had that written down. The only time, I mean, even when they're in where Evil Ed works, because you don't see him in school or anything like that. There's like 4 people in this town right up until they all seem to be congregating in that nightclub. It's
weird.
Sorry to have interrupted. The first thing I am going to say, I do apologize. I am getting over COVID, so my voice sounds like I'm a late night radio DJ.
Yeah, it sounds very sexy. I wouldn't apologize for it. You're doing fine.
And secondly, you mentioned fashion. Mm-hmm. Does Jerry have one outfit?
I think so. He has the scarf. I can see what they're going for with the coat. It's supposed to be big enough that it works as a cape. And they actually do that once in the film when he bites Ed. Yeah. And he kind of wraps the cloak around him. But for the most part, there are a few things that really age this film. And one of them is Jerry's coat. Now, I really want to talk about Jerry in a moment. But it's interesting just because we were talking about the location. And I never knew it was a thing in the 80s, which seems criminal. And apologies if we brought this up in the podcast in the past, and I just can't remember it. This concept of Anywhere USA. So it's used numerous times in the 80s, where regardless of where a movie's shot, they try and make it look like, quote unquote, Anywhere USA. Yeah. So it appeals to as wide an audience as possible. And this film's a perfect example of this. And it's officially listed as being in the location of the movie is never stated out loud. But the director, Tom Holland, not that Tom Holland, listed it as being Rancho Covales, and the film is actually filmed. It's actually filmed just outside LA, and it's only during the nightclub sequence when they're in town that you get that slightly LA vibe. But it's weird that Peter Vincent early in the film gets an eviction letter which places the movie in Iowa, bizarrely, because it says the state of Iowa on the eviction letter. But even Tom Holland didn't know about that because it was brought to him in an interview, and he's like, that kind of totally passed me by. This is supposed to be outside LA. But this whole idea of it, because I was like, yeah, the city kind of looks like LA, but where his house is does look just like the suburbs of the United States. But yeah, it all falls into the very purposeful approach of this being anywhere USA. And I think, you think back to so many movies in the 80s, like Gremlins and stuff, where they have these, especially when they're sets, like in this film, you do get that vibe where it's like, well, where is this? It's the USA. Where? Kind of like Springfield in The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Nobody's exactly where it is. And I just thought that was really interesting.
I always think things like that when I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I thought the one in Gremlins was like Wichita Falls, something like that. You've just got these weird names. And this is the weird name in the suburb of like LA, as you say. Or
it just sounds like the kind of place. It's like, what is the kind of suburb that I bet you like every city in America has like a Wichita Falls or something like that. But yeah, it totally has that vibe, but it is slightly offset by, as already mentioned, when they go to the nightclub in the film and they're walking around a surprisingly empty looking LA. But for that brief period, I was like, this suddenly looks like a cross between Terminator and what is it? There can be only one. A Highlander.
Highlander.
Yeah, it looks like a cross between those two films, and suddenly, like, the vibe and the aesthetic of the movie completely changes. And I think part of it is just the fact that there's so many fucking people all of a sudden.
I love the geography as well. Like, he's been letting his missus apparently walk home late at night through random alleyways before this, because when him and Ed walked her home, all of a sudden they're in dark alleyways and
dude, that is the scariest looking outright, regardless of whether you had just maybe seen a vampire, and regardless of whether you were 100% convinced that Jerry wasn't a vampire. So we're referring here to the interrogation sequence, which feels like it was ripped off directly in The Burbs, by the way. It is so close in terms of tone and setup. But at that point, Ed decides, no, I'm going to take the shortcut on my own down, without question, the scariest alley I have ever seen on film. It is unfucking believable. I was like, dude, I'm 6'7" and I'm 41 years old. I would not walk down that alleyway. I'm like, dude, man, that is rape alleyway if ever seen. He was lucky he only got bitten by a vampire, as far as I'm concerned. Like, what the fuck are you doing going down there? But then Ed is a moron. But we'll get to Ed.
Oh, no, I want to get to him now. I want to bring Ed up.
All right, I'm gonna give a spoiler alert. Ed is on both of my love and my hate list.
Okay,
just to make it clear.
First thing I want to ask you about Ed, and I'll get into a lot of stuff with Ed in a second, but I wrote down something Ed reminds me of. Who does Ed remind me of, dude?
He reminds me a little bit of, I forgot the actor's name, the guy who played Green Goblin in The Amazing Spider-Man. He has that kind of
Dane DeHaan.
Yeah. He has an annoying version of him almost kind of thing. Or maybe it's just the forehead, I don't know. But I
want a film with Ed and Gutter Boy.
Oh, well, he belongs in the same conversation, that's for sure. Yeah. And I will say, right, in terms of structurally how he works in the film, he is totally a progenitor to the Frog Brothers in The Lost Boys. He basically plays the same role. But in terms of how his character acts, there is no way that Beavis and Butthead weren't at least partially, kind of impacted by Ed.
Why would you be friends with a guy like that? I don't understand how.
Well, it's weird because, right, the film doesn't lean into it, but there's a surprise, because for the most part, he's, I guess, playing for laughs, and he's a very big character, and the actor whose name I'm forgetting, thank you very much, Stephen Jeffries, he is swinging for the fucking fences. But in the moment when he gets turned to go back to the alleyway sequence, there's suddenly suddenly a really emotional sequence, and when Jerry's telling him, it's like, oh, you won't be bullied anymore. And, I thought for the most part, I was like, man, I'm not sure if this guy's a great actor, but, he does the whole single tear thing and he seems genuinely impacted by it. And, they hint at this world where Ed is being bullied and he has like a tough home life and stuff, but none of that is presented in the film at all. So you suddenly get this really emotional, surprisingly impactful scene with Jerry. And I'm just like, it's not earned at all. I'm like, I don't know anything about Ed other than the fact that he's annoying, but that scene at least hints that there's more going on in the background.
Because then it just changes then to him with a red wig hiding in Charlie's mum's bed, going on
Yeah.
about how apparently she's working a night shift and she's left dinner. Good, it's in the oven. What the fuck is that about?
That's what I mean. Like, it's weird because everything up until that point is just Ed, like, turned up to 11. Then all of a sudden you get this surprisingly emotional sequence. And then as soon as he's like a vampire, he has the scene when he goes to Peter Vincent's apartment, again, swinging for the fences. And then, like you said, the scene where he's in his mother's bed with I thought that was going to be like a Raggedy Ann doll or something.
Yeah.
It's a huge performance for like 99% of the time, with just this 1% of just this surprisingly, hints at this like character, which, like I said, we never see on screen and we never get any narrative to back it up. But yeah, Ed's a really interesting character and he almost steals the show at times, but he is also super annoying. I legitimately couldn't decide by the end of the film if I liked his performance or fucking despised it. And I don't want to be critical. I can totally understand. He's not the same as, what's his name, Sick Boy and Douchebag from The Wraith. What are they called?
Gutter Boy and...
Like, those two are just annoying. I don't get that. I know some people like them. I think they're just the worst.
I think they're great.
I understand why some people like Ed for that, and I like him to a certain extent, but he walks a very fine line in this film with his performance.
I've seen Stephen Jeffries in another film. I mean, obviously, we've probably seen him in multiple films. But when I saw Ed, because it's been a while since I've seen Fright Night, I instantly went, oh shit, that's the dude from 976 Evil. Have you ever seen 976 Evil?
I never heard of it.
Oh, dude, it's fantastic. It's about a kid who's getting bullied. This same kid, basically, he's playing Ed again. It's in 1988, and he sees a like late night infomercial for Ring Me Up and Talk to Me, called 976 Evil, and it turns out he's talking to the devil. And the devil's given him powers to take out his bullies and things like that. It is a cool film, yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like a Stephen King short almost.
Yeah.
And this kind of has that vibe to it. And I got to be honest, when I was watching this film, sorry, we will get to Jerry in a moment. Because I thought I had seen this film. I had not seen this film. And if I had,
Fright Night.
I had totally forgot. I'd seen the remake. I convinced myself I'd seen this film. I don't think I've seen it. I couldn't remember any of it. And what I remember from Fright Night is the poster. The poster's super iconic and it still looks great.
Well, to the fact they used it the second time for the second film. They kept the exact same poster, but just changed the building underneath.
Yeah, because it's a fucking awesome poster. Like I said, I'd compare it with like Cobra in terms of like iconic posters for films which kind of fell by the wayside to a certain extent. And the weirdest thing with this poster is, because I remember seeing it all the time at the local video shop when I was younger, and I just assumed this was a straight up horror film.
Yeah. And
of course, it's very much not. But the surprising thing when I was watching it was like, we got like 3/4 of the way through the film. I'm like, I've hardly seen any blood. I was like, this is weird. Like, to the point where I was like, this could almost pass itself off as a PG, until the final act when you're like, no, this isn't a PG at all. All of it, when it goes for it at the end, and the special effects are pretty impressive, it really swings for the fences. And I think one of the things that, the underrated aspects of this film is that it's really imaginative, despite the fact that it adheres to the laws of the genre in many respects.
Well, aside from the fact that a vampire can turn into a wolf.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like, it kind of bends the rules here and there, but that's one of the things about this film, and it's similar, again, to bring it back to American Werewolf in London, is that, the vampires all adhere to, like, crosses, crypts, garlic, holy war, all this nonsense kind of thing, like blah, blah, blah. But it's brought up to modern day standards. So they're playing by the standard rules. And obviously, you have the Peter Vincent character who's supposed to be a throwback to like the Hammer horror stuff. Yeah. The only difference is that everybody's more aware of it. And it's surprising, as I said, the same as last week, you don't get many movies where everybody's aware of what's happening. I've talked about on previous podcasts that, you often get zombie films and nobody's ever heard of zombies before.
Yeah.
In this film, the really meta aspect of it is that Charlie is obsessed with vampires. And, it brings it back to how
he doesn't know anything about them. He learns what he needs to learn from Ed. Joe, we said something
which is weird, because he seems obsessed with the TV show, which doesn't make any sense.
We said something last week, didn't we? We said about how last week it was nice to see the rules change, the tropes of the werewolves. And they kind of did the same thing then. I don't think I've seen previously, or actually since, where a cross doesn't work if you don't have faith.
Oh, no, I think I've seen that before.
You've seen that before? I've never seen that before.
I'm pretty sure. Of course, now I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure, you need to have the
Because,
faith.
I mean, if you look at like another vampire film we've done, From Dusk Till Dawn, all you had to do was tick stick two pieces of sticks
Yeah,
together.
yeah,
and
yeah.
you made a cross.
But that's all like, again, we're still bending very traditional rules, which this does. But I think that's what makes it interesting is the thing that makes it meta is the fact that Charlie is ostensibly obsessed with, vampire stuff, which does make it odd that he has to go to Ed about the rules because he really should know them. But they have to give Ed almost something to do.
Yeah. Why did the crucifix work against Ed, but not Jerry from Peter Vincent?
Well, I think at some point, like he seems to have like, if I'm going to read into it and give him the benefit of the doubt, he has like crises of faith, and it seems to be like he has moments when like he sees something he doesn't believe anymore, then all of a sudden he does. But yeah, some of the the impacts of their actions are somewhat inconsistent, and you do have the moment when it's not explained why holy water doesn't work on Jerry. Like that's one of the things that.
That's not holy water. That's what they were saying. When he was on the phone to Ed, and they said, "Will you have holy water?" And he said, "No, because of my." They said, "Oh, it's just tap water. It's literally tap water." He said,
"Oh, yeah, I've got you."
He's telling them, "Don't bring in holy water."
Yeah.
They're telling Charlie it's been.
Oh, that's why he was looking a little bit sheepish. Like, this guy better not have actually brought fucking holy water and stuff. And he was checking it. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. In that case, they do adhere very closely to the rules, and in many respects, Jerry is your classic vampire just brought into the 80s. But it does raise the question, and you brought this up in the introduction, what the fuck is going on with Billy? And we will get to Jerry. I keep saying it. We will get to, we are going to talk about Jerry, the star of the show in many respects. But Billy, I was like, is he supposed to be his familiar? And then at the end, he gets shot a bunch. I was like, no. Okay, is he a vampire? But then, like, goop starts coming out of him. I was like, wait, I have no idea what Billy is. None whatsoever.
The only, because I've recently just seen the film Renfield with Nicholas Hoult and Nicolas Cage. And obviously Renfield has supernatural powers, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but he was just a man to start with. And I'm wondering, is that the same as Billy? But Billy can
melt at the end, though?
I don't know. Like I said, maybe he's been given long life. Maybe he is some sort of zombie.
Yeah, well, that's what I was like. Is he like an undead thing? But then he seems absolutely fine in the day.
Yeah, so there's no explanations to what it is. I mean, the only explanation you get, and again, I love the 80s because you don't know if they're just hinting at the fact that it may be they're in a relationship, Chris and Billy.
There's definitely homoerotic connotations, but again, it's another one of those things it doesn't really lean into.
Because the mum just says, "Have you seen our neighbour? He has a live-in carpenter." What's that about?
Well, it's the 80s, dude. It's the 80s.
He's got a living carpenter.
And there is a way that they, he kind of rests on his shoulder and stuff like that. There are certainly hints towards it being a homoerotic relationship. And, that kind of, you think of the Vampire Diaries. What the hell's the film called? There was a TV show of it recently, the one with
Interview with the Vampire.
Interview with the Vampire. Jesus Christ. Interview with the Vampire. That's the original, and obviously the TV shows really into it is the homoerotic nature of their relationship kind of thing. So this isn't a new thing in the world of vampire stories. But this film, obviously being a relatively mainstream 80s film, only hints at
That's what I mean, because it's an 80s film, and obviously you don't go too deep into that at the moment.
No.
We'll just touch on it. We'll just hint that's what it is.
Yeah.
But also we'll make you think it's not because he keeps bringing in hookers. When you first see that hooker who says to Charlie, "Is this the address?" I had to pause it because I could have sworn it was a young Helen Hunt.
Oh, really? Yeah, I can see where you're coming from.
But no, it wasn't. It's a Playboy playmate named Heidi Sorensen.
Oh, fair enough. But to bring back to Billy, by the end, when he kind of melted and stuff, and it was quite impressive. I was like, were they just thinking up excuses to make the best of Steve? Steve Johnson does the special effects on this film, and he's done special effects on 200 plus films. Yeah. And some of the special effects in this film are actually really impressive. As I said, it's very backloaded. For 3/4 of this film, you don't see.
You're not getting anything.
Basically nothing. And then all of a sudden, it really goes bananas for the last quarter of this film. And I was like, is it just an excuse to have another, admittedly pretty impressive melting body? I'm not sure if it's needed because, this comes hot off the heels of another strange Ed sequence. When Ed does turn into a wolf, we're not sure why, but let's go with it. When he gets then stabbed by Peter Vincent, it's again a strangely affecting sequence where Ed looks in genuine pain, and it's not quite at the level of An American Werewolf in London in terms of the transformation sequence, but some of the stuff when his hand changes, like it looks really good in terms of like, you know, the use of physical effects there. But there is like, they really hold on him when he turns back into Ed, and you can see he's in so much pain. And they, you know, they keep going back between Peter Vincent and Ed on the floor, and they hold the camera on their faces just, you know, to show how disturbed Peter Vincent is by what's happening in his actions, and how, you know, all of a sudden Ed's got a bit of his humanity left and is just horrified by the fact that he's dying. And again, it's this really impactful, surprisingly emotional sequence in a movie that I'm not sure deserves it, to be honest. It's
not for that
strange
character as well, because again,
bizarre.
You've said it previously. There's two characters to Ed, and again, we'll get to Jerry. There's two characters to Ed. There's this complete and utter dick side to him, where that laugh is so annoying. Like how he can be friends with anyone, I don't know.
That's what I mean. Then, he, like I said, walking a line, and he crosses it a few times with that fucking laugh.
And then you get the second, the brief hints that shit is going on in his life. But which is really weird, because like Charlie can just walk into his house. So they're friends. They must be friends.
The thing is, I don't have an issue with them being friends, because I don't think Charlie and even Amy are particularly cool, to be honest. No. I just think one of the good things about this film is that they both feel like the kids next door. Like
Charlie is the biggest gaslighter I've ever seen. And now I've learned what gaslighting means. Right at the beginning, where he's trying to get into her pants. Then he says something about the fact that she won't let him, and he gaslights the fuck out of her. Then she strips off, gets into bed, and he ignores the fuck out of her.
I actually thought, oh, that was quite charming and lame. I mean, well, it's just like, when did movies stop being about, you know, how long it takes to get laid anymore? That used to be like a massive part, like, especially when we were young. You think about when we were growing up and it was all like American Pie and Road Trip. Yeah. Like the core narrative of that film, what's the plot of this film? Trying to get laid. And it was just like, at least in a lot of these films, if they were teenagers, it was a subplot. And I think that's actually true to life, because I'm not sure people have forgotten what it's like to be a teenager, but you're mostly trying to get laid, thinking about getting laid, being jealous of other people getting laid. It was just one of those things. So the fact that he wants to get laid, but he's also obsessed with what's going on out the window because he's kind of got this whole thing with vampires or whatever, I thought it was all kind of quite charming and gave the character a bit of depth, shall we say, kind of thing. And I think it leans into the fact that he's a bit of a loser, and Charlie is a loser.
Oh yeah, he's a complete loser.
Too whiny. What I love is, sorry to butt in quickly, is the fact that Amy is such a ride or die girlfriend. Like, you want a girlfriend, you want a wife, find yourself an Amy. Like, halfway through this film, Charlie's having a nervous breakdown. They clearly don't believe the fact that they're vampires next door, but she's just like, listen, we're going all in on you. Like, she walks in, she sees all the crosses, all the candles, and she's like, all right, if you think it's a vampire, I'm fucking with you. Amy's the best, man.
It's a weird turn though, because about 15 minutes before that, she jams a sloppy Joe in his face.
Yeah, she's emotionally up and down in this film,
and also,
to say the least. But again, she's a teenager. Like, I buy into that.
You say she's all in and she's ride or die. How easy is it to get access to Peter Vincent? Apparently, anyone can just get access to him. If he's outside the house, easy. Or you can if he's outside the studio. He's meant to be like losing everything, a washed up actor, but he's got a TV show that people seem to like. Randomly.
Yeah, I think in the 80s there was like an easier way to access. Like, if you just showed up in the right place.
Yeah, but how are they showing up to his house?
Yeah, I have no idea.
As you say, Iowa.
Or wherever the fuck it is. Yeah, he's another strange character, and it was a bit of a shame that they couldn't actually get Vincent Price for the role. And I think Peter Vincent's apartment actually has a picture, a framed picture of Vincent Price in it, which I thought was a cool nod. And the director, Tom Holland, actually wanted Vincent Price, but supposedly his health wasn't up to scratch at the time. So that's why they went with, who was playing Peter Vincent? Roddy McDowall.
Roddy McDowall, yeah.
I think, most people know him. He was Caesar in Planet of the Apes. He was in Overboard with Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn, a film that I have like an odd soft spot for. They made a terrible remake a couple of years ago, but don't let that put you off. Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn, unsurprisingly, they have amazing fucking chemistry. And it's a silly film, but it's totally watchable. I would totally cover that on the podcast. 100%.
You know what? I'd like to do like a little Goldie Hawn season, because she had a string of films that felt like that. You had Bird on a Wire. which was absolutely fantastic. Private
What was
Benjamin.
the one? Private Benjamin. And my mum loved Goldie Hawn when I was growing up as well, so I watched all these films over and over again.
Yeah.
But I haven't gone back to them. And
No.
like as much, I watched Overboard loads when I was younger, but I haven't gone back to it. But yeah, Roddy McDowall is genuinely good in this, and he chose to play it as like, oh, the character's washed up kind of thing, and he's actually quite a bad actor, but he's obsessed with all this. I actually think he's brilliant. Of course, Vincent Price brings a certain something else to the role. But I don't want to be critical of Roddy McDowall because I think he did an absolutely fantastic job in this film. And again, one of those things that makes this film so meta and feels so ahead of this time is that idea that, you know, this guy's doing a TV show about vampires, but he also kind of believes in vampires.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really smart.
What's nice and meta as well is that his show is called Fright Night.
Yeah. And I thought it was a bit on the nose that at the end Jeffrey feels the need to say this is the real Fright Night. I was like, I'm not sure. You know, we've mentioned in this podcast loads of times, we love it when they get the title of the movie into the actual film, you know, like Con Air and all that, and Face Off and Con Air are probably two of the best examples. But in this, I was like, I don't know, man, you already have the title of the film by the fact that it's the TV show, which is like really cool and meta. I just didn't think it needed Jeffrey to actually have that extra layer at the end. Yeah. Oh, this is the real friend. I fucking give it a
let's go down. You keep calling him Jeffrey. Let's go down Jerry's route, right?
Did I keep calling Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Sorry. Which is, how could I forget the fact that his name is Jerry? Another one of those things with this film. I can't decide if it's the worst or best vampire name ever because it's inherently kind of lame, but if a dude moved into next door to you,
and called himself Vlad,
or his name was fucking Alucard, I'd be like straight away, I'm like, that dude's a motherfucking vampire. Yeah. If a dude is next door and I see him bite a woman in the neck and turn into a bat, and I'm like, but the motherfucker's called Jerry. There's no way he's a fucking vampire. His name's Jerry, for God's sake.
I say it's the weirdest name for a vampire. I think I said it when we watched the trailer last week. That just Jerry, it's so strange. But do you know what? Before we actually,
I think it's really smart. It's one of the few smart things that Jerry does in this film is being called Jerry, and it also brings to my mind like how long has Jerry been a vampire? Because Jerry makes a lot of horrendous decisions towards the end of the film to the point where I'm just like, man, surely Jerry would have got caught ages ago if he was like 200 years old.
I'm assuming he's doing a lot. Sorry, he's doing a lot of moving around. Before we get too much into Jerry, Chris Sarandon. Now, I knew Chris Sarandon for being Jerry, obviously, in Fright Night. But Jesus Christ, that guy moved around the last couple of years from 85 onwards. Obviously, he was Prince Humperdinck in The Princess Bride.
I know him as Prince Humperdinck and as the voice of Jack Skellington. Those are the two things I know him for.
And the other one, another Tom Holland, not that one, film. Chucky, he's
Child's Play,
he was the copper in Child's Play.
That's another film which I watched loads when I was younger, and I've just not got back to. I think I got a bit burnt on like the sequels not being very good, and to the point where it's like I haven't watched the TV shows. I think I watched like The Bride of Chucky like 20 years ago, and I was just like, man, you know, when like good horror goes bad. You know, like in the same way that they turned Freddy into a comedy character. I know Chucky kind of lends himself to that, but I always remember it like the first one was relatively played for laughs, but it was a legitimate horror.
Yeah. And
I think when they moved further and further away from that, I just kind of lost interest in it. And I've heard the TV show's pretty good, but
What's the first season? It was all right. I just never went back, not for no other reason, and I just didn't have time. So
fair enough.
let's get to Jerry then, and let's ask that question that you just asked. Is Jerry actually a very good vampire? Because to start off with, he's bringing people back to his own house, but he's not even bringing them. He's getting taxis to drop hookers off, and these hookers are then disappearing. But nobody's actually questioning the taxi drivers or anything like that. Like,
I'm going to go on record and say Jerry is the worst fucking vampire of all time.
Because he's walked in. I know, like, obviously you can't see his face in the mirror, so he's probably not on security cameras. But there's a load of people able to ID him in that nightclub after he takes out two bouncers quite ferociously.
Well, that is the other thing, like with his temper, because if you go back to the nightclub sequence, it is like, you know, despite the fact that it has very 80s trimmings, I mentioned the fact that it feels like a cross between Terminator and Highlander. But the whole thing about, you know, Amy being under a spell, and again, another one of those like narrative threads, which is never really pulled at. You know, you just see like a frame picture that looks a little bit like
link
Amy.
That she looks like his ex-missus,
his old love or something like that. So, all right, that's all we need. Fair enough. But it goes very traditional with him having like kind of power over her and her becoming obsessed and stuff. But up until that point, Jerry had been all pretty cool. And then the moment one bouncer kind of gets up in his face, he's like, what the fuck? He goes insane and like kills the, well, I don't know if he kills the two bouncers, but he throws them across the room.
He kills them. Dude, he kills them.
Totally blows his cover immediately. And I'm just like, this guy is absolutely useless. Like, he comes across as all suave. And don't get me wrong, you know, Charlie, you've got to keep an eye on your girl, man. If Jerry's about, you know, special powers or not, he's taking your girlfriend if he wants to. Like, he's a handsome dude. But he's a terrible fucking vampire throughout. And even towards the end, he has numerous opportunities to kill Charlie, to kill Peter, to kill Amy. And he turns into fucking Dr. Evil. Everything's over elaborate. He falls into every single trap. I'm like, I know he paints his windows down in the basement. Board them up, you dopey fuck. It's like I don't know, man. Like, the picture suggests he's been around for a long time. He seems utterly clumsy. And like at points, I'm like, dude, it's like you want to die. It's not like Charlie and Peter are particularly good at what they're doing. They're useless as well.
Oh, they're the crap. When he sneaks into Charlie's house and he hides in the closet.
Yeah.
And then he comes out of the closet and he grabs Charlie and he goes,
definitely not gay, by the way.
No,
definitely not gay.
But then he says, we don't want to wake your mum.
Yeah.
And then 10 seconds later, launches him through the fucking closet and just destroys everything.
Yeah, like, couldn't have been louder if he tried. I'm not sure what the deal was with the pencil either. Like, I guess because it looks like a stake, but why getting stabbed in the hand caused him so much grief?
Also, that was a bit of a goof, wasn't it? Because his hand's on Charlie's throat and Charlie stabs him in the hand. So when he turns away, the next thing you see, the pencil is halfway through his hand. Yeah, so Charlie would have stabbed himself in the throat.
Yeah, it's weird. And why did he have, like, in an otherwise pretty pleasant-looking house, the most dangerous-looking window of all time? Like, he pulled up the window and it was just fucking nails.
Oh, because he nailed it down, didn't he?
Oh,
but just beforehand, he nailed it down.
Sorry, this is what happens when you've only just watched the film for the first time. So, okay, benefit of the doubt. But yes, when he's like, we don't want to wake up your mum, and then he's just loud as shit. And it does bring me to one of my issues with this film, is while I appreciate that they swing for the fences at the end, and I don't mind Ed turning into a wolf, I think it looked pretty cool. And I like the fact that, you know, they almost have different stages of being a vampire depending on what's going on. When he goes almost full vampire, they've got too many teeth. And you can see they don't know quite how to act through it. So as good as Chris Sarandon might be, there are sequences when he's got those teeth and his tongue is trying to do something and he just ends up making strange sounds. And I just think it's a poor design choice. I just don't think it works, sadly. And it's not a special effects issue because, as I already mentioned, the special effects are pretty impressive throughout. It's a clear design choice to make their teeth that big, and they're trying to make them unique, I suppose.
Yeah, but
it just it lends itself to a very odd performance in those moments.
For Ed especially, because it looks like he just needs to visit a dentist, because he's got the two ones poking, like the canines, the vampire teeth poking out to the right and the left. And it just looks like he's got gaps in his teeth at the side, but they just look comically too big for his mouth.
Yeah, but the thing, like, I absolutely agree with you. I think they can get away with it with Ed, because Ed's supposed to look a bit dumb, but Chris Sarandon is supposed to be the suave vampire. And there are moments when, like I said, he ends up just making sounds because apparently he can't do anything else with all those teeth in his mouth. And I just thought some of the design choices towards the end in particular weren't fantastic. And I almost thought it was like unintentionally funny, which is a bit of a shame because for the most part, I think this film actually holds up pretty well. And, don't get me wrong, this film is a little bit rough around the edges. And you already mentioned in the intro, the fact that some things just happen. You're like, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it just keeps clipping along. And what this film does have is it's so charming and likable that you're willing to overlook its issues. And the tone helps as well. It's like, I'm not going to take this too fucking seriously. It's a silly film in many respects. But because it is so likable, you're willing to put those things in the background. But every so often, it does kind of lean over and you're just like, I wish they'd done something a little bit different here. And which means, when I look back at this film, you're like, of all the films they remade in the early 2000s, you're like, some of them, they were terrible choices. Like, why did you remake this film? Like, you can't remake Total Recall or RoboCop without Verhoeven or something, because the director's so much of that film. Whereas this film, Tom Holland's a perfectly decent director, by the way.
This is his debut.
Yeah, and he's fine. Like, he went on to do Child's Play, Tales from the Crypt, Amazing Stories on TV. He did Stephen King's Thinner is a film I've got an odd soft spot for, despite the fact that it's not brilliant. Yeah, I know it's not brilliant, but I oddly like it, maybe because I like the book as well. But he's an okay director who's doing a perfectly good job here. But this film was perfect perfect film to be remade, because you can see where improvements can be made. And you're like, well, why don't you just take this concept and give it to a really good director? And that's what they did. And that's what made the 2011 version one of the best remakes of modern times, I think.
It's interesting you say that, because Tom Holland, not a fan.
Well, he's wrong, because it's really fucking good.
He thinks what they did with it was fine, but didn't encapsulate what he thinks Fright Night is.
I can get that. But then it's kind of like the same, like Stephen King famously doesn't like The Shining by, Stanley Kubrick. And it's fine that he doesn't like it.
I don't like The Shining.
That is maybe the most outrageous thing you've ever said on this podcast. I was literally talking to my friend in work yesterday, saying that Shining goes beyond genre description. I never talk as The Shining about it being, is this one of the best horror films? Because it's just one of the best films, full stop.
I was never a fan of it, mate. Never.
Well, in fairness, neither is Stephen King. You're both quite wrong, but it's fine. I mean, I love the book as well. I think Stanley Kubrick made all the right decisions. I don't think you can take that book and put it onto screen, especially back in the 70s. I think the book's fantastic. I think the film is probably even better. I'm quite surprised to say you say it's shit, but
it's weird, because I know we're moving away from this film, but I love Dr. Sleep, the book and the film. I think they're both great.
I like Dr. Sleep. It's nowhere near The Shining. I mean, we were just talking a moment ago about the difference between like bringing in a really good director for like source material and like, what's his name who did Dr. Sleep? Mike
Flanagan.
Flanagan, is that his name? Yeah. He's a perfectly good director, and he did a perfectly good job. And this is no criticism to say this. It's like saying, you're not Steven Spielberg, but he's not Stanley Kubrick, in the same way that nobody's really Stanley Kubrick. And The Shining is on a different level. And that's not to criticize Dr. Sleep, which I think is a perfectly decent film. But yeah, The Shining is in... I'm
criticizing The Shining. I don't like it.
That's bizarre. I think it belongs in the most rarefied of air.
But to be fair, watched it once. Didn't like it. Didn't go back to it. So...
maybe it's one of those ones to do on the podcast, because it'd be interesting to see if you went back to it, if you felt differently about it. But it's one of those films, it's not scary. It's one of those films, it's just all mood and impending dread.
Yeah, and that's what the thing. I might have thought it was a bit boring when I watched it.
I can get that, especially if you watched it when you were younger. We mentioned it on this podcast before about watching films at the wrong time. Like for me, it was John Hughes films, Breakfast Club. The first time I watched The Breakfast Club, I was like 17, 18. The worst possible time, I actually think, unless you were watching it in the 80s at that age. At that time, I was just like, well, that's not how those fucking things happen. Those kids are nothing like me. And I wasn't far enough removed from the 80s for all that stuff to seem charming. It just kind of seemed lame in like the late 90s, early 2000s. But then I watch it like 10, 15 years later, and suddenly I'm like, I can appreciate that it was from a different time and that it's so charming, and I watched it in a completely different way. So a film I might have given 2 stars to when I watched it in 1999, I would give 4 stars to in 2023. It's sometimes these things can happen. Sorry, we have gone off piece slightly.
Let's get back to Fright Night. I wanted to ask, right, what was your favorite showdown? The final showdown, the final showdown, or the final showdown?
It does kind of drag on a bit, doesn't it?
Just a little bit.
Like it becomes a little bit like what we want to like cram in all these special effects. They had 3/4 of the movie to add more special effects. Why they felt the need to have like 17 big special effects shots in like 3.5 minutes is quite funny,
because they thought they killed him, then they find the coffin and he comes out of the coffin.
Mm-hmm.
Then they think they've killed him again, and obviously he comes back more decrepit, and then they break all the windows.
It's a shame, because I don't think Jerry is ever as good as he should be in any of those sequences. I kept coming back to the idea. It's like, Jerry, you've got to be a better vampire. I loved the old school nod when Jerry comes out of the coffin and he literally just kind of lifts out in that old
raises out,
Bela Lugosi kind of way. I love that from a visual perspective. But then immediately I'm still like, dude, you've had like 4 or 5 genuine opportunities to kill these guys, and you just keep missing the fucking mark.
So funny, isn't it? It's a kid living next door. He had every opportunity to just rip his throat out. He's had no problems taking out all these women. But one 17-year-old boy.
Yeah, and let's be clear, Peter Vincent isn't up to much in this film either. Like he's clearly at the end of his tether, and I know he becomes a little bit more competent towards the end, but yeah, that was my big issue. I wish Jerry had been a bit more threatening towards the end, because for the rest of the film, he does carry that charming menace, and it comes down. A lot of that is Chris Sarandon's performance, which I think is genuinely fantastic in this film. I think he, despite the fact that it's in the 80s and he's got the big silly 80s coat, he carries that sense of charm and threat, which I think is the most important aspect for any performance, especially when you go into like classic vampirism, unless you're doing something completely different, like fucking Twilight or something like that. The thing you've got to capture is that sense of both charisma, charm, and threat. And he has all 3 of those. It's just a shame that he can't back any of it up towards the end of the film, which is, No,
he kind of forgets who he is. Like, he's probably forgotten he is a vampire by the end of the film. It's really weird.
Well, he's forgot it's the 80s, because, I mean, he is more than happy to nail high schooler Amy. Like, Amy's supposed to be 17 in this film? And they have sex for sure.
Yeah, and he's like 200 and odd, maybe?
I mean, even if you just take the character, he was like, 43, 44 at the time? Yeah. It's like, I'm not sure that's happening in a modern movie at all. But yeah, fair play to him. He plays it in the old ways. Put it that way, Jerry. I like to think that he's at least 200-300 years old, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
How do you feel about being Charlie and having sloppy seconds with your missus after you just killed the guy she's fucked?
I don't think Charlie can be particularly fussy. I mean, Amy is clearly out of his range. She, like I said, she's proper ride or die. And she does, there's one positive to vampirism. You can go on about like eternal life, all these other things. It sorts out your barnet quick. I mean, I watched this film with my wife and she was immediately jealous. She's like, what's happened to Amy's hair? She goes, I'd be a vampire if my hair just got sorted like that. In the space of, again, about 3.5 minutes, excuse me, she went through about 3 different hairstyles. Her hair just kept getting longer and more luxurious. And I was just like, all right, dude, sloppy seconds or not, you've got to go after, Amy. I'd be more put off by what happened to her face, which obviously they use in the poster. I'm not sure why her face goes like that, but I guess the idea is that she's supposed to be like a bride of Dracula, isn't she? And they always have a slightly different vibe, I suppose.
Dude, that's just totally freaked me out. I just checked that Amy, played by Amanda, I want to say Burse, Bearse.
I pronounce it Burse, yeah.
Yeah. She was fucking Marcy from Married with Children.
Oh, was she? I didn't notice that at all.
Yeah, that's really, like, not too long, like 1987. So 2 years after this?
But that's the thing. She does have that girl next door vibe. Like, she totally has that. She's like pretty, but she's not like ridiculously hot. And that's one of the things I like about this film, is that they, like you said, they are believable suburban American kids from the 80s. Other than the aforementioned dress sense. I don't know what they were going for with this film, why both of them looked like they were dressed from a different era, and why they both looked like they dressed like middle-aged people. And I was like, is this like across the board? But no, Ed isn't. The people in the club aren't dressed like that. And then you get fucking... maybe they're trying to lean into the idea that they're both kind of geeks, I suppose. But he's got like the leather patches on his coat and stuff. I'm just like, it feels like a purposeful decision. But and maybe they were trying to pare back Amy's hotness so that when she does get seduced by Jerry, and obviously the transformation starts in the club. I don't know what happens to her hair in the club, but the hair clip falls out. Yeah. It suddenly gets a bit of like 80s style volume. The next time you see her, she's on the floor. It's got a little bit more dramatic, a bit more kind of reddish. 2 seconds later, it's down to her shoulders, even more red. And then all of a sudden, it's like down to her back and big 80s Julia Roberts hair. I'm just like, all right, if that's part of the vampire experience, fair enough. And it's just another one of those things that, like, it's not part of the rules, but fuck it. If we've got wolves in it and Billy makes no sense, sure, Amy can have 72 different hairstyles. Why the fuck not?
Absolutely.
Although, from a visual perspective, my biggest issue is I don't think the bat worked at the end.
No.
And I can't say bat without thinking of In the Shadows. Bat! But when he turns into a bat and he has like a bit of a showdown with Peter Vincent. I don't think it looks fantastic, sadly.
No, it's that's where it's let down quite a bit with the effects. Like the bat just isn't. I would have preferred it if you still had it as the first person view that you do from the beginning of the film.
Like in which, another thing that Lost Boys stole from this film, and we will get to in Legacy, the similarities between those two films, because this film had a massive, massive impact on Lost Boys. Make no mistake.
Yeah. Speaking of that, should we move on? I don't think. I think
no, that's absolutely fine. Film. So we're on to favorite scene.
Do you want me to go first?
If you want to, sure.
Yeah, it's actually, you go first. I've lost it on my notes.
Mine, again, I could have picked a few of them. There were aspects of the finale that I quite liked, but as I said, I kept getting caught up in the fact that Jerry was being a bit of a moron. So my favorite sequence probably is the nightclub scene, which I think is the perfect encapsulation of classic horror and its 80s setting. I know it goes all a little bit LA, perhaps, but I think Jerry's fantastic in that sequence. I think Amy has a great turn in character, and it just suddenly looks like so many of those 80s horrors that I remember in so many respects, but it keeps its comedy sensibility, even if Jerry does go a little bit off the deep end. The moment once, like, it's not even like the police show up. It's one dude, like a security guy, just puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "Oh, what's going on here?" Surely he could charm in that situation rather than just fuck the whole place up. But it's still my favorite sequence in the film, but I could have picked a whole bunch.
Yeah, sorry, I keep talking really. Yeah,
sorry, Rob. He says it's COVID. He's actually going through puberty at 41. It's all a little bit embarrassing, but what can you do?
Fuck you, I'm 40.
That's the issue you're taking. Yeah. It's not the puberty thing; it's the fact that you're 40. I don't actually blame you. When you get to 40, 41, every year makes a much bigger difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it for me. Again, I could have picked a few, but I had to go with the absolute absurdity of it being. We can't wake your mother. Okay, let's just destroy the entire room. I laughed probably unintentionally at that because I don't think it was meant to be intentionally funny.
No. And there are a few films, as I said, this film is rough around the edges. It's still really good. It's still really fun. But there are moments when you're like, because obviously it is supposed to be a comedy to a certain extent. But certainly watching it back in 2023, there were times when I laughed and I'm like, I don't think I'm supposed to be laughing now. There are definitely elements of that. But so this is one of those core tropes of the 80s, nothing to do with what you were talking about. But dudes, kids having amazing cars, which are supposed to be old bangers.
Yes.
They just had like a little bit of paint. The dude is driving a totally badass Mustang. And then it's like, oh, we'll just have like a bit of paint missing on the side. So, oh, look at Charlie's bust-ass car. I was like, Charlie's bust-ass car is fucking amazing.
Yeah.
I love that Mustang. So sorry, total aside there. In terms of loves, I mentioned earlier, Charlie and Amy actually look like genuine kids. They both have that girl next door.
Really? I thought he was 45 if he was a day.
See, it's weird, but I think that's the fashion sense, though. I think he does look relatively fresh-faced. And it's more the fact that rather than the age thing, it's just they look like actual kids. They're not like the best-looking kids in the world. I just think they're both well cast, and they're both, they don't explain why they're hanging out with Ed, but I kind of get it. They almost have that kind of like in-betweeners vibe. Like I can imagine they're not that popular, but they're not like super unpopular. So it makes sense that Ed might have kind of latched onto them. So yeah, like I said, even with Amy, the fact that she latches onto Charlie so much, the fact that I think you used the term gaslighting earlier, he acts like a bit of a dick, but she still kind of sticks with him, and you can totally believe it because Amy's like perfectly nice, and obviously she has the glam up when she turns into a vampire. But for the most part, you're just like, she's just a girl next door. And I don't mean that in a critical way, so I thought that was kind of cool. Number two, Amy for being a ride or die girlfriend, and the fact that Amanda Burst is so charming too. I think she's absolutely fantastic in this film throughout. So I think she might be like quietly the MVP of this film, despite the fact that there are so many great performances. And I'm going to stick with the big performance in this film, the truly bonkers performance from Stephen Jeffries as Evil Ed. It's nothing if not memorable, but I'll let you get on with your loves next, but we also know what my number one hate's going to be as well, so we'll get to that in a moment.
Well, I'll top off my number one, Ed. Like the performance he's trying to give.
Oh yeah, sometimes he pulls it off, sometimes he doesn't. Fuck, it's memorable. That's what it is.
Yep. I too like Charlie and Amy together. Mm-hmm. I think they're very good as a couple.
Yeah, they never force anything. Like, they don't go on this big narrative back and forth. It's just like they just feel like a young couple who just happen to also be dealing with vampires, kind of thing. They never feel like they need to make a bigger deal out of it. They just kind of like just plods along, and I just totally bought into them as a couple.
Yeah, and finally, I like the way it's shot. The blue tints that you get throughout the film. Like when you're walking down the alley and everything looks blue. And
yeah, they really lean into the classic horror sometimes, don't they? Like sometimes they're playing it relatively straight. This is like a classic 80s, suburban area. And then as soon as he goes down that alleyway, it legitimately looks like Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street. Yeah. And, they lean into all the smoke and everything, and it goes really gothic. And you get a couple of scenes at the house when it unabashedly goes 50s comic book style, when you can see where the smoke is being pumped out of to cover the house. Again, quite chintzy, but always quite charming. And I think it always walks that line so carefully and gets the balance just right in terms of tone, that is.
Yeah. Hates?
Hates, number one. Yeah, Stephen Jeffries. As much as I love him, I like the first time I heard him speak, I was like, what the fuck? I'm not sure if I could deal with this guy, but he leaves his mark, but he is also super annoying. Jerry being simultaneously awesome and an absolute idiot. As I said, I think it's a great performance in many respects, but I don't think the script does him any favors, sadly. And number three, some of the vampire effects are a bit naff. Like I said, not in terms of feeling age, but in terms of the design choices. Like, there's just too many teeth. And we mentioned it a couple of times. There are moments of unintentional comedy, and I just don't think it should come from the vampires. And I don't think it was supposed to, but that was one of my major issues, is that, with the effects towards the end, they go from the sublime to the ridiculous moment to moment. Yeah. I'm like, I see one bit, I'm like, man, that looks fucking amazing. And then the next bit, I'm like, ugh, that's a bit of a shame. But it never feels like an issue of them running up against the limitations of the special effects. I'm just like, I just don't like the design of that. So yeah, a bit of a shame.
Sure. I'll make that my number one as well then. The effects, like some of the effects towards the end I had as well, just let you down a little bit.
Yeah. And it's a shame, like you said, because if the whole film had terrible effects, maybe I'd get on board, but the effects do literally go from very, very good to very, very dodgy in a moment.
And as much as it's not missed, I do feel like some explanation would help. Like how old Jerry is, maybe, who the fuck Billy is to Jerry, what Billy is. Things like that. There was just all these choices that made, and they just moved on to the next one. And finally, that there's only one copper in this entire film, and he is just stupid. I say stupid. A kid told him that his next door neighbor's a vampire. I mean, he came out for that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, the first he kind of plays it down a little bit. I was a little surprised that the cop took Charlie into the house. I'm not sure if that's standard procedure at all, just to be clear. I was actually a little bit more disappointed by Charlie in that sequence, because the cop is there and he says, listen, if you go downstairs, have a look, and you could see them all of a sudden like, fuck, if the cop does go downstairs, we're going to have an issue here. And then for no apparent reason, Charlie has one of his numerous mental breakdowns and starts screaming, oh, they're good because they're vampires, and there's going to be this, there's going to be that. If he just if he kept his cool and said to the cop, go have a look downstairs, I think there's something down there, he would have gone down and had a fucking look. So yeah, the cop isn't exactly competent, but Charlie totally shit the bed in that sequence. But I guess, maybe we would have had a very different film at that point.
Yeah, I think that was my third. Yeah.
Cool. Any alternative titles? I hope not, because Fright Night is a fucking awesome title.
No, there's some alternative ones.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah. Just got to find them. Right. Argentina, The Hour of Horror.
No.
Brazil, The Fright Hour.
An Hour of Horror isn't actually as bad as I thought. It actually works thematically. I immediately wrote it off out of hand because I like Fright Night so much. But yeah, that's not too bad, actually.
I think some of these are probably taken, again, from the name of the TV show within the film.
Yeah.
So, because Brazil's got The Fright Hour, and Bulgaria, Night of Horror.
See, all of a sudden, I'm like, they're all perfectly suitable.
I don't know. Canada's is fantastic. Vampire? Did you say vampire?
Oh, no, that one is fucking bad. Canada? Why didn't Canada just have fucking Fright Night?
Silly. Finland, Night of Terror. Yeah,
you sound like the teenage kid who works at the burger joint in The Simpsons.
Oh, the spotty one.
Yeah.
It's getting bad, mate.
Oh, they're stealing the stuff again.
Finland.
No. Go on, we're nearly there, dude.
Germany, Finland. The Raven, Black Knight.
No, don't like that one.
Hungary. Wedding hoops, dangerous night.
No, yeah, that's got to be a translation issue. What the fuck that is?
Indonesian, Dracula lovers.
No, it doesn't. That just makes it sound more erotic than it is.
Poland, terror of the night.
Mm.
Portugal, the night of amazement.
Yeah.
Serbia, making it sound like a Disney film. My neighbor is a vampire.
That's actually okay. That's one of the bad ones.
South Korea, Fright Night, but Fright spelled Frite.
That sounds more like a chip.
Yeah.
Chip night. Street night.
Spain, Scary Night.
Bit lazy, if anything.
Taiwan, vampires live next door.
Yeah, I can go with that.
Yeah, that's it then.
Fair enough. Any facts? Have we still got it in you? Here we go.
Okay, it was Chris Sarandon's idea to have Jerry eating apples throughout the film. While researching vampire lore, Sarandon looked at information about bats and concluded Jerry had a lot of fruit bat in his DNA.
Yeah, that's pretty cool because there are supposedly more fruit bats out there than like blood bat or whatever you want to call them. And that actually carried on into the remake as well. Like Colin Farrell's character is often eating fruit as well. I think it's a pretty cool little turn.
Because of his theatrical roots and the long hours spent in a makeup chair, Chris Sarandon helped apply his own vampire makeup and often worked on the finger extensions, while the makeup artists were putting appliances on his face.
I mean, yeah, maybe that's why he looks so bad. Like, no, seriously, we have professionals for this. It's like, no, I will help. I will do the eyebrows. Oh, for fuck's sake. It's like, all right, just let him get on with it. Jesus Christ.
Director Tom Holland sought out Brad Fiedel to score the movie because he had been impressed by the music in The Terminator.
It has that vibe. I mean, we didn't mention it, but Jerry's theme in particular has like a hint of The Terminator about it. It almost sounds like one of those 80s like murder mystery shows. Bam, 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 that kind of thing. It's very unique, but it totally works in this film.
This is definitely Chris Sarandon's idea after we said about him having sex with a 17-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Amy resembles a lost love of Dandridge's was Chris Sarandon's idea. Apparently, he wanted, in quotes, Dandridge to have added a dimension and not just be some evil bad guy, where really he just wanted to fuck a 17-year-old.
See, he wanted to lay pipe just like everyone else in this film. It was the 80s. Everyone was super horny. It's just one of those fucking things. He'd had enough of fucking Billy, apparently, or whatever the hell Billy was, which remains a complete mystery as far as I'm concerned. Admittedly, I haven't looked. I'm sure there's like a Fright Night wiki which has answers as to what Billy is. I was trying to figure out just from the movie, and I did not have any answers. But
no, not at all.
But yeah, he's obviously pulled a fast one there. But he got what he wanted. He got his sex scene with Amy, so God bless him.
Charlie's 1966 Ford Mustang actually belonged to Tom Holland. The car was totaled in an accident a decade later.
Oh, such a shame. That he was clearly going for his own Sam Raimi thing. Maybe try and get it into all the movies. But
like the Oldsmobile,
yeah, totally.
Much of the film's $9.5 million budget was spent on special effects. It was the first vampire film to spend $1 million on special effects.
Well, for the most part, it actually, they held up. And I'm sure it was more impressive in 1985. But a lot, we've been critical of them. But just as a reminder, most of the special effects are actually really good in this film. It's just one or two moments kind of take you out of it, sadly.
I'll make this my final one. Cool. A puppet that was created for the ghost librarian's monstrous visage in Ghostbusters was rejected as being too terrifying for a PG movie. When the FX crew subsequently went to work on this film, they realized the rejected model resembled the vampire bat that they created. So they repurposed and utilized it for the vampire's fiery destruction.
That's weird. So what, they had a different design originally for Ghostbusters? And then they
so when the librarian...
The librarian and stuff, because the librarian at the start is fucking...
But when she has
sequence.
When she has a monstrous visage.
Yeah.
Apparently she looked more like a bat that was on fire.
Fair. Well, I mean, in that opening sequence, considering what they were thinking about toning it down from, it was still pretty scary for like a PG back in the day kind of thing. But this was a time when, movies weren't scared or worried about scaring the shit out of kids. That's just what they did.
Sorry, can I do one more? Because this is quite interesting.
Yeah, go for it, bud.
Cast and crew members have recalled that Roddy McDowall videotaped extensive on-set behind-the-scenes footage. None of them saw the tapes, and their whereabouts remain unknown.
Dirty Roddy McDowall. That's actually pretty cool. Which is strange that they couldn't find him, considering we'll get to it in Legacy in a moment. There is a documentary about this film, and you think that would have been a perfect thing to use, maybe, but shame they couldn't get hold of them. in terms of making a change, if we're going to make one change to this film, I've already mentioned, I would have liked Jerry to have been a little bit more competent towards the end. I know we've mentioned the special effects stuff, but I'm fine with those for the most part. My major issue with this film is I wish Jerry was a bit more badass towards the end of this film. So if I was going to make one change, that would be it. And I wouldn't change much about this film. Even the stuff which is a bit rough around the edges, I think it genuinely adds to the charm of going back and rewatching this film nearly 40 years later. But I just wish Jerry was a bit more competent towards the end of the film.
Oh, sorry, I was reading something else, but we're on changes, aren't we?
yeah. So if you're going to make one change,
well, no, to be fair, I'll let you stick with Jerry. I want to know who Billy is.
That's a good point, yeah.
Let me know who Billy is.
Or maybe, see, now I'm just like changing those things. It'd be nice to get a bit more out of Ed, to kind of justify those emotional moments.
Do you really need anything more from Ed?
Well, I like I said, I just think those emotional moments are actually really well shot and potentially impactful, but they just don't have anything to back them up. And I just think even if you had maybe one or two scenes which hinted that he was having it tough in school or he had like a tough home life, that would back it up. But instead, his home life looks perfectly pleasant. He's got like an awesome 80s bedroom. Although I have to ask you this. What was on Ed's desk? So when Charlie calls Ed and he's asking for, what do I do about a vampire? Which is, again, one of the major issues of this film, because he should know what the fucking rules are because he's watching this TV show every night and he's clearly obsessed with horror films. There is like this weird 3D image thing on Ed's desk.
Yes,
I'm not sure if you noticed it.
I have no idea what that is.
An image of like a vampire, classic image of a vampire biting a woman's neck. At first I couldn't tell what the image was, but eventually I paused it. I was like, I think that's like a kind of Bela Lugosi classic biting the neck of one of his victims. But I have no idea what it is from a technical perspective. What was that thing on his fucking desk? You have no idea either?
No idea.
No, I paused it and had a good look at it. I was just like, I don't know what the fuck that is. And I know we're a little bit younger, but, I'm fully aware, like most of the toys you saw in like the 80s, they were still selling those when we were kids. A lot of these, and certainly things used to hang around a lot longer in terms of secondhand. We'd get hand-me-downs and stuff. But that I had never seen, whether it be in my own life or whether it be on like another like TV show or movie. It was just this weird bit of technology. I was just like, what the fuck is that? Bizarre. Anyway.
It's fun though, right? Sorry, before moving on, because you mentioned the desk. It's led me to a question. The crucifix that Charlie uses throughout the film was given to him by Ed, and that looked to be solid gold.
Which he just found on his shelf.
Apparently as well only cost $8 because Charlie gave him his last $8 and he gave him that gold crucifix.
Well, maybe he just didn't give a shit about it. Like, somebody could have given it to him as a gift, like his grandmother, take care of this cross. This was passed down through the generations and it's solid gold, but he doesn't give a shit about that. And then suddenly one of his friends comes up, I'll give you $8. He's like, well, I can buy fucking burger and go to the arcade.
$8, yeah, but he has a job. Evil Ed has a job.
I know, but he's also, in case you hadn't noticed, a fucking moron. So maybe that's it as well. But in terms of legacy, beyond the amazing poster, the combination of horror and comedy here feels years ahead of its time in many respects. As I said, this definitely has one foot in the 80s from an aesthetic perspective, but tonally, as I say, it's weird because you see it and it looks like the 80s. But then the setup and the commitment to classic monster kind of lore is very much from the 50s. But then the way it approaches that lore very much feels like it belongs like 2 decades later. So it's a strange film that feels out of time. Again, much like American Werewolf in London, but in a slightly different way. Excuse me, I think I'm catching a COVID over Zoom here.
Oh, over Zoom from Wales to Edinburgh. Wow.
Yeah, bonkers. In 2011, Craig Gillespie directed the remake, which was one of the best remakes of modern time, I think, which is, I really don't think a surprise because he's a great director. Like, he directed Dumb Money recently, which is a great film. He made Pam and Tommy, Cruella, which is one of the best recent live-action Disney movies. He made I, Tonya. And, it's got a great cast as well. Like Colin Farrell and Anton Yelchin were perfectly cast in the role. Yeah. And I was just like, why don't more movies, if you're going to do a remake, take a film which had a good idea, but it's a bit rough around the edges like this. And you then take that good idea and you give it to a really good director instead of taking a film in the 80s, which had a really good director and giving it to a average director. It's like, well, what the fuck do you think was going to happen? You take a film that can be improved upon and then, you do something new with it. And I think that's why, and don't get me wrong, I think both movies have their place. And I know you mentioned Tom Holland wasn't first on the remake. I actually think the remake's fantastic, but I also love the original. And I think they can both exist quite happily. Yeah. And I don't know. I just think it's a bit of a shame that more movies didn't take that approach. Take a film which was almost brilliant, where you can see improvement and you do something a bit different and you give it to somebody really talented like they did here. There was a documentary, You're So Cool, Charlie Brewster, which is a fantastic name, but I can't seem to find it anywhere, so I wasn't able to watch it. And I already mentioned it previously, it influenced loads of movies, such as The Burbs, more modern movies, such as Shaun of the Dead. But the most obvious one is Lost Boys, where there are so many similarities. So they've got a similar avatar. Charlie and Sam, obviously from the Lost Boys, play a very similar role. Their adversary, Jerry, is very much a mix of David and Max in many respects. The deaths, the idea of every vampire dying in its own unique way, it's not outlined in this film, but it very much happens. You think of the way Jerry dies at the end, he basically explodes in a ball of flame. Ed dies in dies. You know, they certainly suggest at the end that he's come back, but his death scene is much more quiet. Evil Ed is very much the Edgar and Allan Frog of this film.
Yeah.
The big difference is their relationship with the source material. Like Fright Night wants to place, you know, a classic vampire movie in the 80s, while The Lost Boys is as much about the 80s as it is the laws and tropes of the genre. Like, you know, this is a film that just happens to be set in the 80s, where they're talking about, you know, classic monster tropes from the 50s and how they deal with it in modern times. Whereas The Lost Boys is trying to sell you on the 80s. Like, it's one of the most 80s things in the world, and it just happens to have all those monster tropes placed on top of it. But you can't escape the influence. Like, there's no way that The Lost Boys wasn't impacted by this. I know films get made at different times, but was there like 2 years difference between the two films?
Yeah, 87, yeah.
Yeah, there's too many similarities for it not to have been massively influenced by Fright Night. God, I did have a whole other thing about what to make a change of. We've already done it now, so I'm going to have to skip that and go straight to video games.
Can I mention a legacy?
Yeah, go for it.
My voice doesn't feel... Oh, no, there it goes. So from all accounts, McDowell relished playing Peter Vincent and was eager to bring Holland back to the franchise. So he had set up a meeting for Holland and himself with Carolco Pictures chairman Jose Menendez to discuss making Fright Night Part 3. However, before that meeting could occur, Menendez and his wife were murdered by their sons, Lyle and Eric.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, this stopped another sequel and also interfered with the release of Fright Night Part 2, which attained extremely limited theatrical distribution before being dumped on home video. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering why you don't see much of Fright Night Part 2. You see Fright Night everywhere, but you don't see much of Fright Night Part 2.
No, you really don't. And have you actually seen Fright Night Part 2?
Yes, but again, a long time ago. And I've seen Fright Night Part 1 maybe 5-6 times. Mm-hmm. I've seen Fright Night 2 once, maybe.
Well, it's weird because, I know Tom Holland was, I think he wrote the screenplay. So he wrote the screenplay and directed this film. And I think he only wrote the screenplay for the sequel. And it's a bit of a shame because he had previous in terms of doing pretty solid jobs with sequels. Like, he directed Psycho 2, which sounds almost sacrilegious considering the original. But Psycho 2 is a perfectly decent sequel, in the same way that, like Exorcist 3, it kind of gets a bad rap just because it's a sequel to a very famous horror film, and it's not as good as the original for obvious reasons. But, The Exorcist 3 is actually pretty decent in the same way, judged on its own merits. Psycho 2 is as well. So it's a bit of a shame that Tom Holland didn't come back to write and direct the original, but obviously there were issues in the background which sorts that.
The sequel was directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who we like one of his previous films from 1982, Halloween 3: Season of the Witch.
Yeah, not bad. I really like that film.
But then he also directed Vampires Los Muertos, which is the John Bon Jovi starring sequel to James Wood's Vampires.
Yeah, that is rough. Yeah. But the thing is, though, I haven't seen Fright Night Part 2. It doesn't have terrible reviews. It has okay reviews.
It brings back pretty much most of the same characters as well, most of the same actors.
It's just one of those things, sometimes it's like, if you didn't watch at the time, it's tough to go back to because obviously it's not as good as the original, it doesn't have the same charm. But based on the reviews that I read, it's like, it sounded like it was perfect, like serviceable is probably the kindest word you can apply to it. In terms of video games, surprisingly, there was a Fright Night video game in 1988 where players assumed the identity of the vampire, Jerry, is Dandridge, is that his second name?
Yeah, Dandridge, yeah.
Who searches his mansion for intruders to kill, is actually voiced, albeit very briefly, by Chris Sarandon. And it was for the Amiga, and it actually looks pretty decent. It has like big, chunky kind of looking sprites. Very much an Amiga game in many respects, but I'd never heard or seen it before. But I was like, that actually looks not too bad, and the reviews were perfectly decent. And I actually quite like the idea of, instead of playing Charlie, you just play, Jerry instead, and you just have to kill people in your own mansion. I was like, yeah, it sounds like an 80s video game to me. If I was going to have a modern day take on Fright Night, Fright Night. Fright Night. Jesus Christ, the South Koreans have got to me. I would go with the critically mauled, but I actually quite like it, Redfall by Arcane. I'm not sure if you've played that. It was a recent big budget kind of flop for the Xbox Series X. So it was added to Game Pass and stuff like that. And there was quite a bit of buzz around it because it was made by Arcane, who are very well-respected developers. But it came out and it was a bit of a mess. But that game was set in the Atlantic Northeast. I'd have the game set in like the fictional Rancho Carvalis, just outside LA, whatever, in which the vampires, I would have it set after this film that the vampires have moved in and they've run amok and you need to team up with the locals to take them down, basically. So you're playing Charlie, Amy, and Ed, potentially Ed. I know, obviously, he might be dead, but it's a video game. We try and bring him back. But I would just want a slightly more refined Redfall, because I actually think that game was really close to being brilliant. And I think maybe I was one of the few people that actually liked Redfall. Like, it's rough around the edges. I see why people had issues with it, but it had that, that kind of vibe. And I love the fact that it was set in like, Maine, so it looked the part. And I just totally thought, like, in terms of aesthetics and tone, it was actually not a million miles away from Fright Night. So I could totally imagine a Fright Night spin-off where we have like an imagined sequel that kind of follows on, but set in, as I said, Rancho Cordova. So that's my answer for what I would have as a Fright Night video game.
I've never heard of it, but it sounds really interesting. The only thing I could really think of was, I think it was Resident Evil 7, the one in the house with the family. Yeah. I would have that.
That's really good. Yeah, the first half of Resident Evil 7 before it gets a little bit off the rails in the second half. But yeah, when it's all set in the house and you're just, you're playing as Charlie, you run into Amy and obviously Peter, and then you're just running away from...
because you could pretty much be running away from, what was his name, Billy, for most of the time.
Billy, man. Billy. He's such an enigma. That's it. Because
he's the guy who's running the house. And then towards the end of the game, or the second half of the game, once you finally figure Billy out, then you got to deal with Jerry.
Yeah. And plus, you could give Billy whatever fucking powers you wanted to.
Exactly, because they gave him whatever powers he wanted. He was a man who got shot and then had green eyes, and he looked like an extra from Demon Knight.
Yeah, it totally does. Totally does. Yeah, absolutely bizarre. In terms of scores and recommendations, it is another 4, man. I've run every single film. So this is the 5th movie and the final part of our HUGtober season of Halloween podcast. Every single movie we've given a 4 to, and I'm giving another 4 to this. The only difference is I'm not sure if I'm recommending it. This is one of those ones where I'd recommend with caveats. If you hadn't seen it, I would tell you to watch it. Or one of my friends who's like big into movies, I wouldn't just go telling one of my random friends, like, you have to go back and watch Fright Night, because it is a bit rough around the edges. It is a bit 80s at times. And I think you just kind of have to be a bit of a movie buff to want to go back and rewatch this, because I don't think it's for everyone.
It's a 4 for me as well. So I've hit the, I was going to say trifecta, but the...
5 factor, whatever you want to call it. Yep. But so every single film, we've both given them all 4s. But I think that's accurate, man.
Yeah. And to be fair, I would recommend it. But again, we always had a caveat. You would recommend this to horror fans, I think.
Yeah. It's not like I'm not going up to people and saying, dude, you haven't seen Fright Night? You've got to watch Fright Night. Like, it's not one of those.
No.
But like you say, if one of my friends was like into horror films, like, oh, dude, this is totally fucking awesome film from the 80s. You've got to, I mentioned it before. Horror films can be both bad and brilliant. It's one of the few genres where a bad film can still be fun. This isn't that, but it's easier to overlook its issues and rough edges kind of because it's a horror film and because it's so fun. It is part of the genre's appeal in many respects. So yeah, if you're a fan of horror films, totally recommend you go back and rewatch this. Or watch it for the first time if you hadn't seen it like me. But yeah, I'm not just telling any random person in the street, dude, you haven't seen fucking Fright Night? If anything, I would tell them to watch 2011's Fright Night, which I think is a much easier sell.
Yeah, I mean,
being a much more modern film.
You've said it a lot, and I don't think I have, but I love the remake as well. I think the remake is great, but I've always been a big fan.
It's another 4-star film, but in a completely different way.
I've always been a big fan of Anton Yelchin, so
yeah, so really well cast in the same way. But
so thank you for joining us for HUGtober. No, we'll bring HUGtober back next year. So before we actually go into our Christmas season, I've got to ask, mate, are you going to give us another horror film next year? Or are you going to whet our appetites with something else? Or what are we watching?
For next week, you mean? Oh, next week. So
did I say next year?
You said next year, yeah.
Next week.
Yeah, so next week, we've got to give it a break on the horror. I mean, we've done 5 back-to-back. It was an extensive horror season. So we are going to shift lanes somewhat. And given the fact that the fall classic is upon us, which I appreciate for a lot of British listeners, but what the fuck is the fall classic? So that's the World Series. And I am a big baseball fan. And I've always said that whatever your views on baseball, it's maybe lent itself as a sport to movies better than any other sport. Yeah. You can make there's a lot of good American football films. There's a few good basketball movies. Needless to say, American sports just lend themselves better to movies than, say, football, cricket, whatever the fuck. But, baseball in particular, I could have picked any number of fantastic baseball films, and we've already covered The Sandlot a few months ago. But I would be remiss if we didn't cover Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams, which growing up, I think is the one that's had the biggest crossover over here, because it is a baseball film, but it's also something completely different.
But it's just a Kevin Costner film.
Yeah, you don't have to have any interest in baseball for it to be fantastic. It helps because Kevin Costner is the ultimate cinematic baseball guy. But yeah, I watched it a few years ago, and it's still a brilliant film, still super touching, but it's a weirder film than you probably remember. So yes, do join us next week. In honor of the upcoming Fall Classic World Series, we will be looking back at Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams.
Well, I'm looking forward to this, and I'm also looking forward to talking about what I would imagine is an unreleased director's cut of Ray Liotta murdering everybody.
Yeah, well, he's just got that look in his eyes. I'm just not sure if I'm buying him as a friendly ghost, but, we'll talk about that next week. He's so not
a friendly ghost. He's a poltergeist if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, bizarre. Okay, I've been Liam. This has been Rob. You've been listening to Hey Guys podcast, and we'll see you next week for Field of Dreams. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. I'll be better next week.
Oh, and before I forget, where can folk reach us if they were so inclined to?
Well, you can actually reach us on Hey You Guys 80s at Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. But if you want to send us a mail, do heyyouguys80s@gmail.com. Send us in your recommendations. Send us in your thoughts about any of the episodes. Just literally talk to us. We'll have a one-sided talk with you on the podcast.
Yeah. We're nice folk. Get in touch. But no, cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye now.